So hello, welcome to this week's Headlocks and Headphones. Now, I'm not alone today. I'm joined by Zoey Styles. Say hello, Zoey.
Hello.
Okay, so do you want to explain why you're joining me for more of the show than you were originally planning to?
Well, unfortunately, I had some technical issues this week. Apparently, I'm able to mute myself in a program that I've not much experience with. So I did 10 minutes in utter silence, according to what my computer says.
So rather than make you record it again, it's now your homework for next week. I've given you a 1 week extension, haven't already given you a 1 week extension. I will not.
To be fair, the only reason I had a week extension last week is because you bumped me for a better guest.
Yeah, I did plan on bumping you for a better guest this week, but the interview's a bit shorter, so you're allowed to stay on the show. So that is coming up in the second half of the show. We're going to have the second part of the Bradley Craig interview, which I'm very much looking forward to. This last week was the Hall of Fame. What did you think of the Hall of Fame interview that we did?
I found it really interesting. I don't know much about the Scottish scene, so it was fun to hear about the fact that, for example, um, its name's totally went out of my head. Him that worked with Shakara and Colt Cabana.
Yeah, his name's went out of my head as well. That shows how great this can be when you record.
Johnny Saint, there we go, Johnny Saint. The fact that his style that I've seen isn't his original style is something that was really interesting for me. Because I mean, much like the individual that I'm wearing today, Stone Cold, of course he wasn't always a brawler either.
And what's really cool, the fact that you're wearing Stone Cold is brilliant. It's almost like we planned it based on the fact Bradley Craig is the writer of Lady Blossom's biography. Now, Lady Blossom is Jeannie Clark. Lady Blossom is the reason that you have heard of Steve Austin, because she is the one that created the name Stone Cold. Now, I've told you that story, but I will say he'd been handed all these stupid names by WWE, which Bradley mentions briefly in passing in the interview, and it led to her saying just a very British phrase for those who aren't British, which is "drink your tea before it gets stone cold." We apply that to lots of other things, but just have it before it gets stone cold, and that was what made him fall in love with that name, because it just fit perfectly, because it was based on one of my favorite serial killers. Now, obviously, favorite and serial killer probably shouldn't go in the same sentence. Of course, the Iceman, the person who bought a new weapon and decided to go out and shoot somebody and watch them die just to see how cool it was. The Iceman is very cool, I think. Probably not cool
Very
like serial
likely.
killers. Yes, unfortunately. I did give away on the show last week your real name by mistake. So, yeah. Unfortunately, everybody now knows who you are.
I'm the new person here, and yet somehow I'm still not breaking kayfabe.
Kayfabe is dead. Kayfabe is dead. That's all I'm going to say. Okay, so we're going to talk about several things. And what's quite important here is that we were going to do a show where we talk about Raw, SmackDown, AEW, NXT, and everybody's doing that, and it's not very exciting because Raw's not exciting. I'm not massively enthralled with NXT, although it was cool to see Keith Lee win the title last week, so he now holds all of the gold, apart from the tag titles in NXT, which is really cool. Now, the one thing that kind of bugged me last week was Chris Jericho, who came out and said that AEW won the demographic war. Now, the demographic war, there's a certain age group advertisers spend all their money on, and that was one that the AEW brand won. But overall, more people were watching NXT. And this is the interesting thing here, is AEW are happy to talk about their victories. And there's been weeks where they've had more viewers, and that's great. NXT, on the other hand, when they have a week where they have more viewers, Chris Jericho, a person who I have a lot of respect for, and a person that I know you have a lot of respect for, came out and said, yes, but we won the demographic war, which for me came across as very childish.
Yeah, that's kind of what I thought. Petty, childish, certainly not something that, although he is basically the name on that brand, you would expect a little bit more professionalism. It would be different if he were to say, AEW is aiming at this specific demographic and therefore it is great that we have hit that keynote this week.
Well, here's the interesting thing for you. They're talking about advertising dollars being important. And what I want to point out is that the USA Network took a really big gamble. It's something they've done before with Raw, and it's really paid off. So what they did was they cut the adverts. They did have some adverts, but they didn't have lots of them. So what that meant was, whilst Chris Jericho was talking about advertising dollars, the USA Network were more worried about being able to show advertisers at the end of the year, look, we have greater numbers. And the reason I bring this up, because I did mention it briefly before, the reason I bring it up is because Nielsen are changing how they work out the ratings. Now, obviously, depending on who you speak to, there's slightly different methods. One's the logbook, the other one's digital recording of what people are watching. And there's obviously an amalgamation of various methods around the world. Everybody uses different methods to work out the ratings. The important thing is that only works out the number of houses that are watching. It doesn't work out if, 6 people go around to have an AEW party. That's really hammering the AEW ratings. Vice versa, NXT, if they have lots of people in watching, then that harms their ratings. So Nielsen have hit upon this idea for a while. They want to look at the figures a little differently. So they're going to look at the ratings, including pubs, bars, entertainment venues that are going to be showing the show. Now, what that means is that in terms of the actual numbers, they're going to be able to show perhaps a 15% increase in America with the volume of bars that are open till late, that show sports on their screens. There's going to be the ability for them to turn around and really, according to the numbers, they're expecting 15% extra. So for some networks, that's, hundreds of millions of advertising dollars. So when you look at what AEW and Chris Jericho are suggesting, which is this idea that, yes, but we won the demographic war. Interestingly, this new Nielsen rating system looks like it could benefit the USA Network because of the higher numbers generating higher revenue down the line. This could lead to a massive change where you'll see certain networks perhaps drop the high level of adverts that we're seeing and go to streamlined, less adverts, but worth more money, which could be quite an interesting way of working things out. The one thing there is, and hopefully I can get your opinion on this, we've been in bars where there's been football, there's been wrestling, there's been UFC, there's been boxing, and if you're having a drink, 9 times out of 10, you're not watching what's on the TV. You're talking to your friend. So I think the new rating system, whilst it might lead to more money, is probably going to lead to miscalculation of how watched these shows actually are.
I'm concerned about how they figure it out. I mean, in the same way that one house could have 6 or 10 or 2 watching, how did they figure that out with pubs? Is it one pub, one viewing? Or did they presume there's a minimum number in each pub at any one time? Realistically, some pubs may literally just have staffing who turn it on in the background and nobody can see it. And like you say, people go in there to socialise, they go in there to have a good time. They don't go in there to sit and criticise AEW or NXT for the length of time.
And if you're in a bar having a beer and you see AEW on the TV. Now, I've been hypercritical of the AEW product. You know this. That's why I subject you to watching this aberration every week. But one of the things that intrigues me is this idea that somehow pubs could be used to get extra viewers. For example, and I'm not saying this is the case, but what if the stadium at Fulham, which is owned by AEW, were to put up 800 TVs in key locations and they were to air AEW during every Fulham match? Okay, it's ridiculous. But say they've got 15,000 people there. Is that an extra 15,000 people watching AEW? Because it's on in the background the same way that bars are. I know that's absurd, but as a point, you brought up the idea of how do they work out the numbers. Well, realistically, I don't think they can. I think it's guesswork. But ratings are guesswork.
Well, that's the thing. In this modern age, so many people are putting it on DVR, they're watching it on social media. Some of them are pirating it. Depends, obviously, on what your experience is.
Well,
And
this brings up a great point. Sorry.
there's no real way of pinpointing those numbers down. I mean, a lot of arguably real wrestling fans, from what I read on the forums, bear in mind this is just my opinion, are those that watch on the internet. Those are the ones that are subscribed to AEW Dark, the Young Bucks own reality show, and they may watch along live, but then also watch it on their TV on the rerun on 5 Star.
Well,
And
here's the thing that I want to put across. I had an argument with somebody on Twitter, shock horror, but I love statistics. You saw how many statistics I used for a presentation when I was at school, and one of the things that's quite interesting is I did have an argument with somebody, which it was them stating quite clearly the reason the AEW ratings are low is nothing to do with the fact that the show makes no sense or that there's things that are happening that people don't want to watch. The reason that their ratings are low is because AEW put their content up on the internet too quickly. So instead of watching the whole show, people are watching the videos on YouTube. Now, I made the point that what that should tell you is there is content that people want to watch in AEW, but not all of it. And that, for me, is the problem that AEW face. But one thing that isn't looked at is the numbers from the WWE Network. The volume of people that likely do not watch NXT live and do not watch NXT on the USA Network, but wait a day and watch it on the WWE Network, or watch it at the weekend, or watch it on the bus on the way to work, which I think I've also made this point here on the show. The numbers are never going to be a true reflection because, unfortunately, there is no consistent method for working out those numbers. And realistically, here in the UK, you've got AEW on a network that, because it's got the ITV branding on it, should be huge. But the likelihood is it's really not that big. And the only issue that's at stake here is at one point, Impact was being watched by more people than Raw in the United Kingdom. And people said, well, that means that Impact's a better product. No, that meant that Impact was free. And you'll watch a free product, whereas if you had to go and pay for Sky, it's not such a good deal. And there's a lot of people turn around and say, well, Raw's going to suffer in the ratings in the UK because now it's behind a paywall. It's always been behind a paywall. Apart from a brief period, as mentioned before, where it was on ITV, there is no real national representation for the WWF, WWE, unless you count that year it was on Channel 4, and no real fan does because of the fact that every time there was something important happened, they went to an advert, which is just horrible. Right.
I think part of the problem now is the changing culture as well. Like, you were telling me stories about when you were a kid and you used to get the VHS tapes that your mum's boss would record off the live feed.
Yeah.
And you'd watch the whole thing because you knew that for like 2 weeks that was your wrestling. Whereas nowadays, as you so politely pointed out on the interview, my generation have less of an attention span for that kind of thing. You know, I can watch the Sunday morning Raw and get everything I need to in that hour.
And even
for
worse,
me, watching
we can go on here. We can go on here and we can watch the Drew McIntyre segment from Raw and nothing else, if that's all we want to see. And I think that we live in a society where we don't know how lucky we actually have it. I remember, if you missed Raw, you just didn't see it.
I mean, that was the same for me when I was a kid. Obviously, like, I'm talking 10 and under. You know, when I was a kid, I had channels 1 to 5, and we were lucky if 5 worked because of the signal issues. And you watched what you got to watch, and that was it. Whereas now, our son, 2 years old, knows what the YouTube logo looks like.
And can operate YouTube as well, which is even worse.
Knows what the sound of Netflix is, and he just clicks what he wants to click, and that's it.
I mean, that's the thing. I think we are somewhat spoiled. I do want to mention one thing quite funny. A few weeks ago, I showed you clips of a TV show called TFI Friday. Robbie Williams appeared to perform the song Old Before I Die. And he changed one of his lines, I hope I live to receive Channel 5. So instead of, I hope to live to see the day the Pope gets high, I hope to live to receive Channel 5, which I thought was quite funny because at that point, Channel 5 didn't have a great signal. However, for those of us who were lucky enough to have cable, we actually got Channel 5, and they had the best chat show. Better than James Corden, I'm telling you, because it was done by Jack Doherty. I know you're thinking, I don't know who Jack Doherty is, but he's the police boss in Scott Squad.
Ah, of course. Yeah, no, I know who you're on about.
Yeah, with Grado.
I'm not that young.
What was that?
I'm not that young.
Well, right, so let's move on to some other stories, some good, some bad. The first one is about Will Ospreay, and he's dealing with depression, thoughts of suicide, and he has went online and thanked his fans for their support. This is one that's going to cause a lot of conflict. Nobody wants to see anybody depressed. Nobody wants to see anybody with thoughts of suicide. Certainly not either of us. But this is somebody who was named in the Speaking Out movement as somebody who had somebody blackballed from shows. And the reason that the person was blackballed from shows was because they'd reported they'd been sexually assaulted by somebody. And Will Ospreay has been linked to claims of having had her removed from shows. And there have been emails floating around. And again, this is just allegations. There could be some crossed wires. There may have been an intent there. He's already made it clear in several tweets that sometimes he's a bit stupid and he says things in text that don't come across the way he intends. Something which you yourself know quite well. So it's just one of those, even if the allegations are true, I don't want Will Ospreay to be depressed and thinking about suicide at all, regardless of any allegations against him. So, it's kind of worrying to see that wrestlers out there are dealing with both sides of the Speaking Out movement. And that's not to say that somebody's right, somebody's wrong in terms of the allegations that came out. Or the person making the allegations. What I mean is, until now, I can't be the only one that I didn't really think about the person who's been accused of something and how they're thinking. What I've been thinking about so far is the people making the accusations, and if those accusations are true, how they have felt. So hopefully, and I know Will probably won't see this, but at the end of the day, I hope Will manages to feel better, and I hope that there's no long-lasting issues there. I know he's had mental health issues for a while, so it's good to know that he's at least talking about it. That brings me to the next story. Now, I know this seems like I've planned this as a trajectory for the show. This is all just kind of making it up as we go along. It's the best way to do it. So Sunny, Tammy Sitch, got released from jail a couple of months ago. She set up an OnlyFans account, which I showed you and showed you the price of. Apparently, she had 11,000 members. At the price that it was at, she was making about $35,000 to $40,000 a month just from putting pictures and videos up online, right? Which is up to her what she does. It's her career, her job, her way of making money. That's fine. Doesn't bother me. But she has been issued with a bench warrant for her arrest. Now, she has been charged with operating a motor vehicle during a second license suspension, eluding a police officer, contempt, and violation of a domestic violence restraining order. Now, all I'm going to say is, every time she appears to get herself back on track, whether you agree with her doing porn or not, because some people see her doing porn as her career being on the slides, right? Regardless of that, every time she appears to have herself back on track, something like this crops up. How do WWE have to keep stepping in as a former employee? Because every time the mainstream press mention her, she is Sunny from WWF. So they always have their name attached to her, and they've paid for countless rehabs for her. And there's stories going around of things she used to do in ECW for drugs and the amount of alcohol she's consumed, and she's told her own stories. Do WWE have a duty to kind of reach out again, or do you think that they've tried and that's it?
I certainly think that there's always going to be, whether they think it's right or not, there's always going to be that level of responsibility, because that culture started off in their domain, in their house, and there was a lot of the same kind of thing going around with different groups that we're not going to go into. So therefore, I think, like, thus far at the very least, I mean, it's much the same way that, not bringing football into it too much, but much the same way that ex-Rangers players, because we are both blue, will leave the club and then they'll be invited back. And it doesn't matter how long you've played, it doesn't matter how long you've been with the club. If you were there for a single season, you're still part of that family. I certainly think Sonny built up enough ties during her time that, it's the theory of Kevin Spacey, the links. There's only
Kevin Bacon.
Kevin Bacon. Thank you. There's only 4 or 5 links away from someone to someone that you're kind of acquainted with, but therefore responsible for through that link.
I mean, she's a WWE Hall of Famer, but she has had, I mean, some estimates suggest over 10 rehabs, some of which have been, £30,000-40,000 a month. She had one that was imposed on her by a court. She's had various chances to get herself clean, and from some of the tweets and posts that she's been putting up, she seemed to be kind of back to her old self. Always controversial politically. She's a Trump supporter, but at the same time, she appeared to kind of have her old voice back, if you know what I mean. But
I mean, like, we know ourselves that doing psychology and kind of having experience in a variety of different areas, that it only takes one thing to set somebody off.
yeah.
She could be perfectly clean, happy, posting whatever it is she's posting, and then run into somebody and suddenly feel that instant urge to go and do something silly.
I mean,
and if there's no network there, if there's no support after that point, are they just there until she gets out, or are they helping her in the long term? We don't know the backstory. And
that's one of the things. I mean, this is issues that she's been dealing with for a long time, and thankfully, she's not going out doing wrestling shoot interviews and stuff, because a lot of these shoot companies really take advantage of people like Sonny. And they took advantage of Marty Jannetty as well. I mean, I'm a fan of Sean Oliver and kayfabe commentaries, but at times, the Breaking Kayfabe series did take advantage of people who were very vulnerable. I know Jim Cornette did it, and he wasn't vulnerable. He just wanted a chance to speak. But, Marty Jannetty wasn't quite in the right place, I don't think. And then, obviously, Sonny wasn't quite in the right place. But hopefully, they're talking about revoking her parole, which means more jail time. So hopefully, whatever it is that's going on eventually gets sorted, because, as you know, I'm a Sonny fan. When it came down to Sonny versus Sable, I always opted for Sonny. I always prefer the girl next door look to the fake big boobs look, which is why I probably disliked the divas in WWE so much for so long. Now, we're talking about divas again, and this seems like I'm doing this on purpose, but this is completely not on purpose. This week, Tegan Knox put up a picture of herself with her partner, and her partner put up the same picture. And Tegan Knox, this was her way of coming out as gay. She actually did say on the backstage reaction to her coming out, and I'm going to read the quote out. My life has always been a don't ask, don't tell situation, but I felt like it was the right time, especially when you've found the right one you're in love with. It was the right time to do that. The reaction's been great. There are a few people who obviously don't agree with that, but 99% of the reaction has been positive. I've got texts coming through from so many colleagues and friends. It was nice. It's great to see there are so many nice people in the world. Now, I have a problem with this.
Of course you do.
Yeah. Now, my problem is not with the fact that she's gay, because you know what? If she is happy, I couldn't give a crap who she sleeps with. As long as you're happy, sleep with whoever you want to, unless you're married, and then you got to sleep with your partner. But what I mean is, like, there are people out there who feel that they can tell other people that who they sleep with isn't the right person, and I think that's if a parent comes out and says, I don't think you should be with that person, they're not good for you, then that's fine. They're at least looking out for the person. But when somebody basically disagrees with the fact that somebody's sleeping with the same gender, for me, that's ridiculous. I've never found out that somebody was gay and went, oh, well, that's weird. Or why are they doing that? It makes no sense. And if you're smiling because you think I'm going to tell the same story that I normally tell when I say that, I'm not telling that story. I don't want to give that person any airtime. But it's great now that people are getting comfortable with being who they want to be and not hiding it. But hopefully, at some point, we'll get to a point where it's not a printed story on wrestling news sites or in gossip websites. Hopefully, we'll get to the point where Tegan Knox has a girlfriend. That there is no story there. She just has a girlfriend. And I think that that's still something that, Sonya Deville was, as far as I know, the first openly gay WWE female performer. And people said, well, Pat Patterson did it years ago as a male performer. Well, the guys knew that he was gay. And by the guys, I mean those in wrestling, not the gendered term. The wrestlers mostly knew he was gay, but it wasn't really out with the fans. And the reason for that would have been because of the amount of prejudice there was. But you look at it today, and I don't know. I know there are homophobic people out there. I know there are people out there who see somebody coming out as gay as, oh my God, I can't believe they're gay. But for me, it's like, okay, fine. Don't care. It's not really a thing. What do you think about this? Because can you think of, if I was to say to you, tell me an openly gay singer, you would be able to go, Adam Lambert, you'd be able to go Elton John, you'd be able to go through the list and find quite a few. If I was to say to you, tell me an openly gay wrestler, then you start looking at Orlando Jordan and you start looking at Darren Young. But then after that, there's no one. Because it's not, there are people in the indie scene who are out. There are people who are, in various levels of wrestling that are out and gay. But it still seems like a lot of people are worried about it. Do you think that it's because when you mentioned football earlier. You look at football, and the last openly gay footballer was over 20 years ago, and he was hounded out of the game. So, do you still believe that there is that pressure, even though everybody's openly so accepting? Do you think there's still that fear and dread that it's going to harm people's careers? It's going to harm their personal lives if they come out and reveal who they are?
For me, my personal stance is much the same as yours. People can like people, it doesn't matter if you're a guy, a girl, somewhere in between. How you feel is how you feel, and nobody should be able to disrespect that. Like I said, there are circumstances where somebody may not be good for somebody else, but that's not based on creed, that's not based on religion or anything like that. It's based on who they are. I think professionally speaking, there is still a massive prejudice against some in different professions where even if you don't think you're homophobic, the fact of somebody coming out like that can still be a bit of a shock. Again, personally, I wouldn't consider myself homophobic in the slightest, but I also grew up in a very sheltered childhood where I never came across other people, other beliefs, other, sexualities. And for me, having that kind of discovery as I was growing up was brand new. It was scary until I suddenly, one day just went, right, okay, fair enough.
But see, that's the thing. I had something similar. Yeah, I had something similar. I grew up where there wasn't many people who came out, but now, I'm 36 years old. I'm looking back, and there's a few people I went to school with that have come out, and you're looking at it going, makes sense. But I've never went, oh, I can't believe they're gay, because I don't think it doesn't make that much difference to me. And I don't know why. There are some people out there who seem to think it makes a difference. Tegan Knox is a great in-ring performer. I don't think she's going to be a Hall of Fame performer, but that could always change. And the fact is that I bring this up because I want to talk about Cody Rhodes on AEW this week. Now, we've had a busy week, and I know you haven't watched AEW this week. We did have Brian Cage, who lost to John Moxley via submission, but it was actually when Taz threw in the towel, which is a very interesting way to end it. It's going to be fun to see where that goes. But that wasn't, for me, the big story that happened in wrestling. The big story on AEW was the fact that Sonny Kiss got a TNT Championship match. Now, it's an open challenge belt. For me, anybody can get a shot without being at the top of the rankings, and that's great. It makes sense. It means Cody has a fresh opponent every week. However, people were using the F word, and I don't mean French Connection one, right? People were using the American F word, the one that the Americans use for gay people, because Sonny Kiss was getting a title match. Now, Sonny Kiss has already revealed that, he doesn't see himself or herself as a he or she. There's days where they're somewhere along that line. But people, because of their sexuality, were calling them the F word. And for me, it shows, whilst we're sitting here talking about the idea that it shouldn't matter, it clearly does to some. And if Sonny Kiss is dealing with crap like that over a script, and I don't want to use the other F word, fake, but you know what? It's a fake fight on a scripted TV show, and people are so pissy about it that they are angry that a gay person got a title match. Why should it matter? It really doesn't matter. If you're bothered by someone's sexuality, go and take a look in the mirror, because the chances are there's probably bigger questions for you than whether Sonny Kiss is in a fake match.
I certainly think that it's good in the sense with things like Tegan Knox, where she feels comfortable enough to come out as a public icon and be able for other people to say, right, I am a public icon, I am in the limelight, and I still feel comfortable coming ahead with this because of the support I've gotten. If you feel comfortable doing so afterwards, it could just put that light on, even for 10 or 20 people out there who suddenly go, do you know what? I look up to her. She's doing something with her life. I feel comfortable, even just telling their parents. They don't have to go and post on social media about it. If a girl or a guy goes home that night after seeing Tegan Knox on the post and goes, do you know what, Mum, Dad, come and have a chat, that could change somebody's life for the better.
Because do you know what? Depression from those kind of things is a killer. And to know that the chances are there's a stage in Sonny Kiss's life where the conflict was every single day internally dealing with that until the comfort was there to tell the people you love. And it shouldn't be like that, because you know what? I never felt difficult going to my mum and saying, I'm getting married to Zoey Styles. I never felt uncomfortable telling my friends that I was marrying you. And the reason is because nobody that knows us thought any different of the fact that, well, they're in a relationship, they're going to get married. It shouldn't matter if it's two guys, two girls, a guy and a girl, or two people who don't identify as any of those genders. Now, I know the gender debate it's one for a different day, but if you honestly are more bothered about somebody's sexuality than whether the match was entertaining, then the problem is not the match, and the problem is not the talent involved in it. The problem's probably you. And I saw this stuff on Facebook, and I really do want to kind of avoid these places. So what I've been doing is every time I see one of these pages that allow this stuff, I remove myself, because I just don't want anything to do with it.
I find what's quite interesting, just to take a little point further, again, this is a little bit personal for me, but there was someone that I knew when I was younger for many, many years who would often use the phrase, I don't mind if they're gay as long as they don't do it around me, as long as they don't, hit on me because they know I'm not. Now, for me, although they seem quite accepting of the fact that that is a thing that is going to be around them. The
There's
fact that they would
layers at
still
that,
want to
yeah.
distance. Yeah, the fact that they would still want to. I mean, they're quite a bit older than me, so it could be a generational thing. But like I said, you don't. For me, you don't realize that you've got those kind of thoughts until it slaps you in the face.
And knowing who the person you're speaking about is, the chances are that that was around you quite a lot. And that can shape who you are. And prejudice breeds prejudice. And apparently, we're still bringing people up to think that somebody's sexual. I think the problem is that you just have this group of heavily religious people that want to control everything that everybody else is doing. I want to say it's crackpot Americans. And I'm sorry if you're American and you're religious and you think gay people are wrong, but you're a crackpot. But we have them here in Scotland now as well. We have the Scottish Family Party, and you know there was a story on the BBC the other day about somebody who lost his job and he started selling pictures online, akin to what Sonny's doing, and they're saying that it's the BBC promoting the breakdown of conventional life. I think conventional life is already not really existing anymore. You know, not everybody gets married, not everybody has 2.4 children. Life is different to what it was 100 years ago, and eventually you have to kind of catch up. The dinosaurs have to eventually become extinct.
Even just say 15 years ago, I remember when I was in secondary school, we had a religious teacher who was a practicing priest, and he was also gay as well, and he wanted to get married. He was told quite categorically, because he sat and he spoke to us about it one day, because we were on that topic, that he would lose his priesthood if he married the person that he wanted to marry. Now, I was never clear whether that was because he was a priest or because he was gay, because I do know that there are some priests out there who aren't allowed to marry. It's not the done thing.
And I believe now there are some gay priests. I believe there's been a relaxation in that. But it's weird to think, I mean, we don't have a written constitution in this country. But if you look at, obviously, religion plays a huge part in the basis for our education system. And I don't want to decry anybody for their religion, because your beliefs are important, just like someone's sexuality is important. But if your belief is to be kind to each other, and you want to label somebody a negative term because of their sexuality, then at some point you're given mixed messages. Anyway, let's move on from what's a really deep sociological debate where we could spend the next couple of hours talking about this. There are stories floating around, started by Raven, that Billy Corgan's going to be shutting the NWA down. Now, I'm going to read out the quote for this. I think Billy is shutting it down from what I hear. Plus, Billy really does the booking, all the booking. At least he did with Resistance Pro. I want to do a Raven impression, but I'm not very good with them. He liked me there to have my wrestling mind so I could say yay or nay to ideas. If they make sense, if they don't. Ultimately, he had the final say on everything, as he should have been. I heard from the grapevine, I heard that Billy's not opening back up. He's really disillusioned. Now, part of the reason that he would be disillusioned if he was is Dave Lagana was his right-hand man, and Dave Lagana was part of the speaking out allegations. So there is a tangible element of truth there. There is possibly a reason for him not to be opening back up again. Billy Corgan has come out and issued a statement where he basically said, a quick note about the National Wrestling Alliance, which I fought for and won ownership of a few years ago. We are not shutting down. Please disregard any and all rumour to that effect. The NWA is not and will not be for sale, and those talent who are under contract remain under contract for a reason, which is that we are the NWA, and we're trying to figure out a way to provide our great fans with wrestling content. And most importantly, keep our talent safe and the standard of production you've come to expect from us at a high level. Now, I really enjoyed the NWA shows, up until they fired Jim Cornette over a stupid joke that Dave Lagana had the final say on whether it went in, and Dave Lagana stuck around. Now, Jim Cornette, if he should have went, Dave Lagana should have went as well, because Dave Lagana cleared the joke. And that, for me, was the only issue I had with the NWA, is the fact that Dave Lagana shouldn't have been there. And then obviously, based on the allegations, probably shouldn't have been there anyway.
Can you clarify something for me, just as a modern fan?
I'll try.
I've always understood the NWA to be this kind of conglomerate. I mean, I know obviously back in the territories they were massive, but in terms of modern speaking, when you're talking about shutting down the NWA, are they essentially just now one company, the same way Impact are, or the same way
That's
Smoking Bones once a day?
okay. So that's a great point. So the original NWA was basically designed like the mafia. It was a family of wrestling companies that worked together, largely illegally, to monopolize the industry. So if you screwed over one NWA promoter, you couldn't work for another NWA promoter because they would blackball you. In addition, if you, for example, were running your shows in Ohio and an outlaw show, as they were called, came and tried to work in your area, then 3 or 4 of the other companies would send some big name talents in to run big shows to try and make that other company suffer so that your show would still survive. So it was illegal, using very much the same tactics that the mafia would use. And it was something that you would pay to be members of. There have been UK companies that have been part of it. NWA UK Hammerlock, the SWA in Scotland was also a member at one point. So it used to be something you paid a membership fee to. And then obviously there'd be champions that would tour the world. So when Billy Corgan bought it, he decided to do a complete rebrand. So he'd done away with all, I mean, at one point there was basically NWA titles all around the world. And there was NWA titles. So you had, like the North American title, you'd have like the Ohio title, you'd have TV titles, but every company would have an NWA TV title. And then there would be an NWA TV title that was on whether it be the Georgia Championship Wrestling or later on WCW, stuff like that. So when Billy Corgan took over, he decided to basically make it, there's no licensing anymore. It's just the NWA. So it's just our company. And they would have talent that was contracted to them. And initially, the NWA would put their matches on other people's shows. So the NWA title would appear on the first ever AEW show before it was AEW, when it was just All In. The NWA title would appear in Ring of Honor, be held by Cody Rhodes, and be defended around the world. So now it's one company as opposed to many that share under an umbrella. The level of corruption, we have a great NWA book that you should have a read of because it's so stat heavy, but it's very, very cool. Now, obviously, it'd be remiss of us to not talk about COVID-19, so let's get it out of the way. DDP revealed this week that QT Marshall had tested positive for COVID-19, and that's why QT Marshall was pulled from his tag title shot alongside Dustin Rhodes a few weeks ago. It also looks like there was some issues for Tony Schiavone this week, where he actually was still awaiting his results from his COVID-19 test, so he was pulled from the show as well. At least they're testing, and I think that's the important thing. They're testing their talent, and that's the best thing that can happen. Now, Pat Buck was a producer who was released as part of the April releases. There was some talk, because he was brought back a few weeks ago, that meant that he was only furloughed, but he was, according to him, officially released and then rehired. Everybody that's been rehired and not furloughed, to be clear, has come back on a lower contract. So WWE are giving everybody that is coming back a much lower contract. I know Sarah Logan was offered apparently a 40% pay cut to come back, because obviously there's no house shows or anything. And that obviously gives them the potential to get bigger deals down the line. But it's good to see people like Pat Buck. Pat Buck's been involved in helping some of the talents that have come off the indie scene in recent years.
Have they at least known this going in? Were they
No.
spoken to and said, listen, due to COVID, due to the lack of house show, can you potentially come back on a lower contract? Or was it kind of lower contract or nothing?
Okay, so that basically is it. Lower contract or nothing. Pat Buck wasn't told he was getting brought back, because that wasn't really the plan. Although it could have been. It's one of those, You know, you never quite know. But at the same time, Lance Storm and MVP were two other agents that came in at roughly the same time. MVP has been very quickly moved into a talent contract over being an agent. So it's interesting to see what's happening there in WWE. You don't want to see anybody lose their jobs. I know we talked about it when it happened. The level of
I would
people,
have thought an agent contract would be paying less than a talent contract.
it usually is, yeah.
So then why would they move MVP to a talent contract?
Because when he debuted at the Royal Rumble again, he kept appearing here and there, and then they offered him a chance to be an agent and obviously work with the younger guys. But then when they realized how successful he was on screen and the fact that, you know, he actually was very good at helping Drew McIntyre leading into WrestleMania, I thought the VIP lounge segment with Drew McIntyre, I think, made Drew look really good. And I think that made them realize it might be worth putting him into a talent role. And because he's in a talent role, and usually he's in more than one segment, he's in a match, a segment, and then a backstage segment with somebody else. So he can't really be an agent as well. So moving him over to a talent contract is probably the smarter move, knowing that if you've got MVP backstage and there's somebody that needs some advice, MVP can still give that advice. So it's great to have. I mean, I've always liked MVP, and I think that he shouldn't have left when he did, because I think, you know, if he'd taken maybe 6 months to a year off and then came back, I think he would have been a huge part of the story.
All right, Murphy, listen up. Seems like I don't have your full attention. It seems like me doing everything lately just hasn't grasped what I need from you to give me what I want. But you know when you lost your set of keys? Yeah, that's right. It just shows what I'm capable of. It shows that I can be wherever I want, and you don't even see me. This all ends as soon as you say yes. Give me an answer. One word.
We did see one thing that I'm kind of happy with. It's been a few months since Shayna Baszler's been on Raw, and she returned this week and beat up the ninjas. Yes, there's ninjas on Raw. Yes, it's stupid. Yes, Tozawa is being treated with a character that's fairly racist. But at least Shayna Baszler got to come and beat some people up for a change. Now, this did lead to some more BS on Twitter where somebody called her ugly. I'm sorry, but why on earth would you call Shayna Baszler ugly? Whether you think she's attractive or not, I don't see the point in going on Twitter and calling somebody ugly. You can go and argue about somebody saying something wrong or stupid or whatever. That's fine. But if all the argument you have is, well, you're ugly. Okay? Yeah, I am ugly. You're still stupid.
Well, that said, not condoning those tweets in any way, but if we didn't have those tweets, we wouldn't have that fantastic segment. I believe it was Jimmy Fallon who had the celebrities reading out these tweets and basically just contorting with them, which is comedy value.
Yes, right. Now, let's move on. I know you dislike this, so let's talk about something you dislike before you have to leave us. On Sunday, Extreme Rules, the horror show.
I don't understand. Like they're one step away from naming it after a pantomime, you know?
Well, let's go through the card. Let's see what you think about the matches. Let's see what you think's going to happen. I know certainly there's a few Raws recently you've fallen asleep during, and trust me, so is everybody else. But let's go from the bottom of the card to the top of the card. I'm going to be honest, it's not a great card. They've only got 6 matches so far. Look for something probably to be added on SmackDown, likely involving Nakamura and Cesaro versus New Day, possibly. Seeing as that storyline seems to kind of chugging along quite a lot. Apollo Crews versus MVP for the US Championship. I'm really liking Apollo Crews, and I know they've
I
done.
thought they were in a segment together. I thought they were like a team.
No, well, he's MVP's asked Apollo Crews, and he keeps turning him down. Now, obviously, during a period of the Black Lives Matter, putting together a black team's probably not. It's pushing buttons that don't need to be pushed. I don't think.
I think if it was creatively done, they could form a new nation that would perhaps alleviate some of that stress in certain ways. It depends on obviously on how it was booked and how carefully it was done. But this is the same WWE who are putting ninjas for the Japanese man.
Yeah, but the one problem here is that when the New Day took a knee for Black Lives Matter, it was a sign of them showing support for a protest movement, which I personally, despite some conspiracy theories, I think the original message, not the one that the others are taking on, but the original message is great, and I fully support the idea that people should be treated equally regardless of skin color, sexuality, gender, all that stuff. But you mentioned WWE booking this stuff properly. They're creating the Nation 2.0, which we've talked about before. I'm not a fan of this concept, but in a period like this, when you book the Nation 2.0, admittedly, MVP, a much better speaker than Ron Simmons, but you're still booking them as heels.
What gets me is, like, realistically, if we are going to fall down this rabbit hole and this is going to become a thing that we're going to watch and it is going to form, who's taking The Rock's spot? Surely not Apollo Crews. Now, don't get me wrong, I've got nothing against the guy. He's a good in-ring performer and he is half decent on the mic. But he ain't electrifying anybody.
See, here's the thing. Now, originally, the Nation was athletes of a particular skin color, and then Owen Hart became a member. But originally, Bill Dundee's kid, JC Ice and Wolfie D, were actually rappers for the Nation of Domination. So the original Nation was essentially a way of putting these guys together because there was something happening in the real world. And I get WWE like to respond to the real world. That's why, as you know, there was a women's movement in the real world, they finally stepped up and had some good women's wrestling on their show. I just fear they're going to go down the route of playing the race card almost. And for me, it's cheap. And when you play that card and you make them the bad guys, it just seems like they're just trotting out the same stuff over and over again. And I'm not a fan of that. Now, if we move on to the next match, which I've been a fan of the story because it's involved his son Dominic, but Rey Mysterio versus Seth Rollins, an eye for an eye match. The match
See, that one's I know it's called the horror show. And I know I'm a bit of a wimp when it comes to things like this, but eye for an eye just sounds like far too extreme, especially for something that's supposedly being pushed as a PG show.
Now,
Every time he goes to grab Ray's head and put him toward that seat, physically I have to turn away. It creeps me out.
But this is the tagline for this match. The match that can only be won when one competitor extracts an eye of their opponent. Now, unless Seth Rollins or Rey Mysterio have actually lost an eye and they're wearing a prosthetic and they're just going to turn this into a storyline, this is absolutely ridiculous. This has got hokey mid-90s WCW garbage written all over it. And for me, you know, if they called it an eye for an eye match, then fine. If Rey Mysterio gets his revenge on Seth Rollins and Seth has to wear an eye patch, then fine. But they're talking about the only way the match can end is to extract an eye.
No, I'm totally with you there. I think that it's ridiculous, it's gimmicky, and there's no way that can end without. I mean, for example, with Edge and Orton, and they've got the greatest wrestling match ever. And you start going, wait, what? No. You cannot book something as the greatest wrestling match ever, A, when you haven't seen it, B, when there are thousands and hundreds of other matches.
Thousands and hundreds.
Yeah, I know. I'm very technical with my numbers here when I'm ranting. But there's so much of a criteria. We don't even agree on like the 5-star rating stuff. Because, 6 out of 5 stars, what kind of moron does that?
Dave Meltzer does that. That kind of moron. More about him later. So Braun Strowman versus Bray Wyatt in a Wyatt Swamp fight. So this is another cinematic match, which, I think it's too soon to take the belt off Braun Strowman. Why on earth you would put this back together again? But by the look of it, it's Bray Wyatt and not The Fiend. Or is it The Fiend? Because The Fiend should be called The Fiend Bray Wyatt. But instead, it's just labelled as Bray Wyatt. So it'll be interesting to see which version shows up, if it's The Fiend or Bray Wyatt like we saw in the last match.
I'm not big on these cinematic things. I mean, the last one that I genuinely can say that I enjoyed was the Hardy Compound. Because
really? You weren't a fan of AJ versus Taker?
No, I didn't like it. I thought.
Well, I question our entire marriage now. I honestly felt like that was the most amazing way to tell a story of The Undertaker literally driving off into the distance. This was the last chance to see The Undertaker, and it was him beating AJ Styles. I mean, the story itself is brilliant.
Don't even get me started on Taker. The fact that he didn't retire 3 or 4 years ago when he left his hat and coat in the ring still nags me to this day. He could have retired when Lesnar beat him, and I got that money off of you for that WrestleMania. Don't get me started on Taker. But that aside, the cinematic itself, it claims to tell a story whilst also wrestling, whilst also pitching in something for everybody. And for me, it misses the point entirely. I didn't like the Adam Cole Velveteen Dream one.
Neither did I, to be honest. But here's the thing. Do we keep the cinematic matches when the fans return?
No, I think that what we have to do is perhaps, potentially, if it's safe enough, obviously, go back to the days of the empty stadium or the fan line stadium, like, where you get the lumberjack match with all the wrestlers around the outside. Have an arena match where there are fans everywhere. There are fans lining the place, and you're able to actually just wrestle in different places, and people don't feel like they're missing out. For me, with cinematic matches, the fans miss out. It's basically just like watching a DVD at home. And why are you spending $70 on a seat for Raw or for SmackDown to sit and watch something on a big screen TV that you could have done at home?
I mean, the point you're making is valid. Now, Bayley versus Nikki Cross for the SmackDown Women's Championship. Not a fan of. I'm not a fan of her heel turn, but I'm also not a fan of Bayley overall. And I don't think Nikki Cross is going to get that one, unfortunately.
I certainly think Bayley's heel turn was a long time coming. The fact that she's done it with Sasha is probably not the greatest thing, but I'm just not a Sasha fan.
Now, I did see one thing. I did see one thing, which is that Bayley's going through her emo teen phase right now. She went through her huggy phase, and now she's moved on to being an emo teen. But
she's in her, late 20s?
No, we're talking about in terms of the evolution of the character. Not that she's a teenager, but the hugger was her child that hugs everybody and is always happy. And then obviously, as you become a teenager, you become an emo. So that's the character evolution.
So are we going to get, a buttoned-up Bayley in a couple of months when she, I don't know, gets the Raw Women's title but loses the SmackDown? She'll come out in, like, a, I don't know, office uniform or something like that and just
to get a 9-to-5 job.
Start taking people really seriously.
I can't take Bayley seriously at all. She will always just look like your friend's little sister.
I think there's a lot that could have been done with her that wasn't. I mean, she was a great asset when she was in NXT. They kept her there longer than they probably should have because she helped the other stars as well. Backstage, she's got a brain up there.
Well, see,
The
that's
fact
the
that
thing. I mean, Jake the Snake has openly accepted that he did not get the world title because he was too good. I mean, it's ridiculous. But there is a story of Jake the Snake and Hulk Hogan were beginning their feud, and apparently they filmed something, and it was designed so that Hulk Hogan would basically get beat up by Jake the Snake, and the fans would essentially start cheering for Hogan, who would then rally up and pose. So Jake beat him up, Jake gets backstage, and then all of a sudden, Vince McMahon comes up to Jake and says, wait for it, wait till you hear the fans chant Hogan, and then he's just going to write a check. And then all the fans did was cheer for Jake. And Vince looked at Jake and went, that's just cost you millions. Jake was so good, they wanted to see him be the world champion. And I think at one point in NXT, Bayley suffered from the same thing. She was so good that they couldn't call her up because the roster wasn't deep enough to survive without her. And then when she did get called up, it was too late. And I think all the momentum was gone. And I think that's something, if you look at the next match, I mean, Asuka versus Sasha Banks for the Raw Women's Championship. Asuka, someone who had so much momentum until she got beat by Charlotte Flair at WrestleMania. And Sasha Banks, someone who at one point had so much momentum and then it just kind of vanished. I think the common denominator here is choices in booking. But it's interesting. Bayley defending a championship and Sasha Banks possibly winning it. Do you think Sasha Banks is going to get the Raw title so that they both have 2 belts?
I hate to say this, but it's maybe likely. I don't like Sasha. I really like Asuka. I've got both her masks, and I've cheered for her basically her entire career. However, they have to do something to take away from the 2 belts Becky.
And I think when we say things like we dislike Sasha Banks isn't her real name. We're talking about the character, not the person. But I agree. I'm not a fan of Sasha Banks. I think she's overrated. But I do think she will get the title.
I was quite interested. See, when she actually came back after that stint away, where she came back with the blue hair, she pulled the purple off, and then we saw her heel turn. There was so much she could have done with that would have made me want to watch her. But now she just comes across as a stroppy child. There is an element of her character where she is the boss, she is the big I am. And you can get behind that because you think, do you know what? Her theme song was so catchy for the first little while I had it as a ringtone.
Yeah.
Because it was in my head constantly. However, now that she's basically just sat riding Bayley's coattails for however long.
Actually, did you not film a video dressed as Sasha Banks once?
I did, but that was for a challenge and that was completely separate. There wasn't my choice and somebody put that on me.
Oh.
Had it been my choice, I would have probably went for a male wrestler because, I don't want to be half naked strutting down the hallway.
Okay. I just wanted to get that out there. So, the main event, Drew McIntyre versus Dolph Ziggler in a match yet to be determined. What do you think?
I'm interested to see what the stipulation is. I think it's quite clever that they've let Ziggler choose it. He's been an underdog for so long now, and there was that time where he was interesting with The Miz, where The Miz basically went, well, what are you playing at? You've been the best for so long. Actually do something with it. Why do you keep stopping short? And they had that career-ending match that was fantastic. I really enjoyed that.
When he had no music
he kind of slipped away into oblivion again. And
I mean,
the fact that he is finally getting propped up with that kind of opportunity, I want to see what he does with it. But the only way that this can end is by Drew winning. Because if he has got such a short title reign, Scotland is going to erupt.
Absolutely. Now, there is reports that Drew is going to be facing off against somebody at SummerSlam, and it looks like he's going to lose the title at SummerSlam to Randy Orton. Now, the reason for that is the intention is to have Randy Orton carry it through to WrestleMania, where we will see Drew actually get his WrestleMania moment. I would support that because a win over Randy Orton at WrestleMania would be a good moment for Drew. And we could celebrate that with fans.
What's wrong with people having long reigns, though?
I think it's about giving him his moment, though, because if you look at Shawn Michaels in '96, when Shawn Michaels at SummerSlam, he faced off against Vader, and Shawn was meant to lose the belt to Vader at Survivor Series and then win it back at the Alamo, at a building in Texas, which was actually the Royal Rumble, which was meant to be his coming home story. It was meant to be his redemption, but the fact that he had his boyhood dream, he lost it, and then he got it back. So for me, I think Vince is probably trying to tell the same story with Drew, which is for me, it's really interesting. Now, two quick things before you have to go. Do you want to go with the quite deep one first, or do you want to go with the smaller one first?
Let's go with the deep one first, because then we can use the smaller one as an excuse to wrap it up. Because, you know, as much as I love this show, I also love all my other hobbies that I'm not doing at the moment.
Okay, so Dave Meltzer, remember him?
Yeah, the guy with the 6 out of 5 stars.
Yes, so he has labeled the AEW tag division as the most stacked division ever, except for All Japan Pro Wrestling. Now remember, All Japan Pro Wrestling did tours, which meant that they could cherry pick the best tag teams in Japan, cherry pick the best tag teams around the world. Now for me, this is just a further indication that Dave Meltzer is just losing his mind. Now, for him to turn around and say that Private Party and SCU are a good team, right? But are you telling me that the Bulldogs, Demolition, the Brainbusters, which is Arn and Tully, the Bulldogs, the Heart Foundation, Arn and Tully, Demolition, then you go underneath that, and you had so many other teams in the WWF at that point. Or you go to WCW, who had Doom, the Steiners, and the list goes on. And you're telling me that the AEW tag division, and Dave Meltzer even lists, and this is the point that bugged me, even lists Chris Jericho and Sammy Guevara as being, you know, part of that most stacked lineup ever. They're not a tag team. They're people who have fought in tag matches together, yes, but they're not a tag team. They're not in the tag division. Jericho's in a different division. Sammy Guevara is not a tag team wrestler. To argue that because they've had tag matches, it's the most stacked tag division ever, except for All Japan Pro Wrestling because of the process they use for booking the shows, is ridiculous. And for me, it's just another indication that Meltzer has a bias towards AEW.
I have a few questions about this, because you can actually like dissect this quite a lot. Does he mean stacked as in quantity or stacked as in quality?
He means quality. He means quality.
The fact that he's used ever is another issue that I'm going to sidestep for the moment.
So one of the things that fans are pouncing on is they've listed 11 tag teams that could all potentially hold the tag titles. And what's quite funny is that Private Party got a win over the Young Bucks, yet it was done in such a hokey-pokey kind of way that it would have been better if they'd actually just got beat, because it didn't help them at all. Or the fact that the Lucha Brothers don't know how to wrestle in America. And people can disagree with that, but, you know, Jericho himself said they had to be told to hold the tag rope. They had to be told that they couldn't just, you know, one person goes out the ring and the other can just jump in. They hadn't even defined the rules when they started the show. And for me, when you still have production errors that are happening, there's so many things wrong with AEW that, for me, pull away from the quality of the product. And obviously, COVID-19 is changing things for everybody. But when AEW were putting on shows, when I was watching them, and you're seeing, you know, the Young Bucks do 20 moves, and then they end up in the exact place they started. So that's great, but isn't the point that you're trying to win? And don't get me wrong, there's guys in WWE doing the same stupid stuff. There's guys in NXT that do the same stupid stuff. But the point should be about watching something and being entertained by it, rather than watching it and going, Well, that's stupid. Why are they doing that? That looks very that looks very indie. And that for me is AEW is still at this point, it's got some great talent in there. And for me, Chris Jericho, one of the best ever. You know, Cody Rhodes, Dustin Rhodes. I'm a fan of Jake Hager, but not. I would never put him as a main eventer. And then underneath, Luchasaurus is somebody who's got potential. And then obviously Marco Stunt is somebody who annoys a lot of people. And I'm intrigued what they're going to do with him. But for me, the dark horse in that whole company, everybody says MJF is a dark horse and is going to be the biggest star. For me, it's going to be Jungle Boy. Jungle Boy is going to be the guy who, in 10 years' time, there's going to be a bidding war and he's going to make millions of dollars if he's still in wrestling. Because I think he's got the kind of look where he could follow his dad and move into acting. But Jungle Boy, for me, is going to be the most over guy in that company, given time. But for Meltzer to claim that the AEW tag division is the most stacked ever is delusional. Particularly if you're looking at, a period in the 80s where you had, the Bulldogs, Hall of Famers, Heart Foundation, Hall of Famers, Demolition, Hall of Famers if they weren't suing the company. So the list goes on. Legion of Doom, Nasty Boys. I mean, at one point, WCW had, so many great tag teams during the forgotten 90s era that everybody thinks is garbage, that it makes the
AEW the most decorated tag team ever.
Who?
Team 3D.
Yeah, but even then, that's looking at a different era because I was looking specifically at the 80s. You're looking, Team 3D came along when you had Team 3D, the Dudleys, the Hardys. Team 3D are the Dudleys. Edge and Christian was what I meant. Shh, don't mock me. But you also had the Hollies. You had even TNA, Test and Albert. And then you look at TNA, for me, at one point, they had a better division. Now, yeah, you got FTR and you've got the Young Bucks, and everybody seems to like the Young Bucks. But for me, the Young Bucks are what they are. They are middle of the road, and they don't tell a good enough story. But they are exciting.
Quality for me with tag divisions comes down to two things. A, the quality of the teams themselves in terms of the camaraderie, how long they've been together and all that kind of working stuff. But B, the chemistry between them and the other teams. Are they on the same level? Can you see them beating each other and competing in what would be a fair bout back and forth week by week?
That for me is a problem. I think Meltzer is suffering from the shallow Hal principle. Because the Raw and SmackDown tag divisions are god-awful, he is overinflating how good the AEW tag division is. Now, so the last story I want to talk about is about AEW as well. And it's about the fact that somebody who was actually speaking to Tony Khan when the foundations of the company were being set up. And that person was Jim Cornette. Now, you can assume that he's advised, don't use Vince Russo because he's an idiot. And you can assume that he's basically said to stick away from the garbage wrestling and to certain things that he's suggested. However, what is quite interesting is that Jim Cornette claims that he was asked and had to sign a non-disclosure agreement. He's alluded to the fact that there is some things that people would like to hear. Now, I would like to hear what they told him he couldn't say to everybody. There must be something if they had him sign a non-disclosure. And I want to know what it is. What could they possibly have asked Jim Cornette not to talk about? Knowing that Cornette will talk about anything, and Cornette's quite open. Even when allegations were made about him, Jim Cornette was open. So what could the non-disclosure be about?
I think that's maybe the very point of it, is the fact that Cornette is very open. So while things that he might think are just completely irrelevant, if he says them out loud, it could have consequences. And you have no idea what they are. They could be the most minute things ever. You'll be talking about a conversation about two people in a relationship, and then somebody goes, oh yeah, I saw him with another blonde the other day. They were having sushi and holding hands. and then you suddenly go, well, wait a minute. Like
I
that seems
know.
so innocent to the one person, but as soon as somebody else hears that who has a different take on the story, can turn into something that much more.
Perhaps AEW had an investor. Perhaps there was somebody involved financially that Cornette knows about. Perhaps Shane McMahon. I mean, I'm not suggesting that's the story. I'm just saying perhaps there's somebody who's involved in financing it. Maybe Ted Turner. Maybe somebody was involved and backed out later down the line. So it's I've never heard that before, of somebody discussing terms with a company and being asked to sign a non-disclosure agreement. And I hear it happening in the real world, but you never hear about it happening in wrestling. Okay, thank you for joining me. However, before you go, because your homework was a little bit latchy, right? Next week, you are doing your top 3 wrestling belts ever. Is that right?
That is correct, yeah.
And you're returning to doing AEW as well.
Yeah, I am going to actually watch it this week. I think I've just been distracted with the little one being a little unwell, and really just the product being makes me sleepy.
So this week, we are doing part 2 of our interview with Bradley Craig, and this part is about the biography he wrote of Jeannie Clark, Lady Blossom. Lady Blossom, of course, was originally brought into the wrestling business by Chris Adams, married Billy Jack Haynes, and married Stone Cold Steve Austin. Not even slightly awkward that Chris Adams trained Steve Austin. So a little bit of a story that you might want to see in the biography. However, Bradley goes into details about the method behind writing the book and talks about the kind of person that Jeannie Clark really is. Now, what did you think of part 1 of the interview? You did mention it at the start, but what did you think of Bradley and his knowledge?
I think that you could genuinely sit in a pub with that man for 4 or 5 hours, just buying pints and listening to him chat. But I'd do the same with you, though, because obviously, like you were saying on part 1 of the show, that your knowledge is minute compared to his. Mine is minute compared to yours. And I was actually sat on the bed playing a game whilst listening to him. And every now and again, I would pause my game to rewind to re-listen to something, because it was intriguing. It was, the fact that he has the final say on who goes into the Hall of Fame, and he doesn't just want to dilute it. Obviously, that was a clear dig at some of the Hall of Fames that we know.
Not going to mention any names.
Nope. And it's a complaint that I've had in the past as well, where you sat looking at 10 or 15 people going, okay, what now?
Yeah, and I think what it for me is quite interesting is this is a guy who clearly just loves wrestling. Now, there are some stories he told me that I probably can't share, and they aren't in the second part of the interview. But my hope is that we can get him back on and we can get some more stories. He did promise me a WCW episode that I'm going to hold him to. I want that WCW episode. But until then, we're going to leave you with part 2 of our Bradley Craig interview, where he talks about Jeannie Clark and her biography. So, alongside Jeannie Clark and Neil Cameron, you wrote the biography for Lady Blossom. Now, many know her as Steve Austin's ex-wife, but she was also married to Billy Jack Haynes and had a relationship with her trainer, Chris Adams, who would also go on to train Stone Cold Steve Austin. Now, how does a historian from Scotland get involved with writing the book for the former manager from WCCW and other companies?
Okay. I know it sounds like a kind of really random thing, but we had quite a lot of mutual friends. Where does this begin? I used to do a lot of graphic design for professional wrestling industry, such as, book covers and things like that. I was also involved in just writing small articles here and there. And one of the people that I was often in contact with was a guy called Dennis Brent, who was the former editor of WCW magazine as well as WWF Raw magazine. And he was also the ghostwriter for Stone Cold Steve Austin when Steve Austin did his book. Now, when Jeannie was looking at doing her autobiography, one of the guys that she approached to be her ghostwriter was Dennis Brent. So Dennis said that because of the fact that he'd done Steve's book, he didn't think it'd be a good idea to basically do her story, because there would probably be a bit of preconception about her journey, and he thought that there might be a bit of conflict of interest there. But he actually recommended myself to work with Jeannie, because he said at the time, nobody knows the inner workings of WCW like Bradley Craig because of World Championship Wrestling was really the product that I just absolutely loved, and I've been a huge collector of World Championship Wrestling stuff. I've got employee newsletters. I've got I've just hoarded everything you could possibly imagine relating to that company. And also, I've interviewed a lot of the people that were involved in that company. So I just had a kind of strong knowledge of that promotion. But not only that, I was a huge fan of Steve and knew Jeannie's career. And it wasn't necessarily that was the kind of deal breaker, but it was the fact that I also had the knowledge of British wrestling. So when you take someone that has a knowledge of British wrestling and then WCW, you almost have Jeannie's journey.
Yeah.
So
that's fascinating. So can you describe for me what the process was like, trying to write somebody else's life story? Because it wasn't just you. So Neil Cameron involved in the writing process alongside you, or did he have a different role?
Neil Cameron was involved in an early treatment. I think he did about 35, 40 pages originally, but most of his work, which is some of it's still in the book, he was involved in collating things like Kevin Von Erich's foreword, and some of the quotes from there's some quotes throughout the book from other wrestlers. So he was involved in that aspect more than I was. I was basically the principal writer of her story from start to finish. His role was more the kind of supplementary information, such as quotes, etc., fact finding in terms of that.
So what was the process like for telling the story? I mean, was it, because I know Ric Flair mentioned the fact that he had was it like 7 or 8 phone calls with a ghostwriter who went off and basically wrote kind of elongated versions of those stories. So what was the process like with Jeannie?
It was completely the opposite. We were on the phone all the time, right? Constantly, because of Jeannie's pro wrestling career was relatively short, and that's not to diminish her contributions to pro wrestling, although her career actually spans quite a long time. If you actually look at it, she was involved in wrestling from 1979 even to almost present day. That's quite a long time, but her career in terms of pro wrestling was maybe a year or two in World of Sport. She was involved in the USWA. They did the storyline with Steve and Jeannie versus Chris Adams and his wife at the time, Tony. And then she did about 6 months or so in WCW. And that's basically her career in wrestling. But when I started speaking to Jeannie, I understood that there was this tremendous human interest story. And that was what really drew me to her story more than anything, because it was a story about a person accidentally falling into wrestling, and not necessarily going into wrestling as a fan, like so many people involved in wrestling get into wrestling because of being a fan. She just accidentally fell into this kind of wonderland full of these amazing cast of characters. It was almost like, and this is where the story, the title of the book came from, because the book's called Through the Shattered Glass. I saw so many similarities to her story and the Alice in Wonderland, tale, the kind of idea of someone just going through the rabbit hole and then finding all these wacky characters like you get in pro wrestling, and
I
also
mean, when you're talking about wacky, I mean, she married Billy Jack Haynes. You don't get any more wacky than that.
he's wacky now, but I don't think he always was.
No.
No. I think he's changed quite a bit because of personal choices.
Yeah, if for anybody who hasn't seen it, there is a shoot interview that he did about conspiracies. I'm not going to repeat any of them, but go out of your way. It's definitely an interesting watch if you've never seen it.
Mhm.
So, when you have all of these telephone conversations,
Mhm.
how do you sift through the stories that obviously you have interest in,
Mhm.
and the stories that would make a good book,
Mhm.
and the stories that she really wants to have in, but Steve will sue her, or Billy Jack will sue her, or somebody might take offense to the story that would cause a problem? How do you balance that and tell somebody else's story?
Well, I mean, the thing that's amazing about Jeannie is that she's the least bitter person in the world. And in terms of when you think about when pro wrestler wives have told stories, there's often an element of bitterness in terms of, you look at the likes of a Linda Hogan book or some other books that are on the market, and some of them haven't been particularly flattering. But the amazing thing about Jeannie's story is that so much of her tale was about her 18-year battle with drug addiction
Mhm.
and overcoming that, where she really owned all of her, her failures, and was completely honest about so much stuff. It was such an important story to tell. I I was just amazed at how this person accidentally went into pro wrestling, had a life that took her both sides of the Atlantic to the top of the World Wrestling Federation. I mean, although she, it was Steve's career in the WWF, she was involved in so many aspects of his character. It
I mean,
was
the
just,
most important one is on her
yeah.
because of that English phrase, drink
Mhm.
your tea before it gets stone cold. And that's probably the most famous wrestling character
Mhm.
ever. I mean, Hulk Hogan's probably the most famous name, but
Mhm.
Stone Cold's probably the most famous character ever.
Yeah.
And I think people sometimes forget how important that person behind the superstar is, especially knowing that things didn't work out for them. But there was obviously, when he's main eventing WrestleMania, his kids are in another continent,
Mhm.
and there's another parent who has to pick up the pieces from that.
Mhm.
Did you enjoy writing what seems, from what you're saying, almost like it could have been a dark book but has a positive ending?
Mhm. Yeah. I mean, I wanted to do justice and capture her voice. I didn't want it to just be a book where you take stories and try and make it either as marketable or as shock value just to get a headline. I wanted it just to be an honest portrayal of how Jeannie would tell her story if she was telling her story to someone at a bus stop or something like that. I just wanted to capture her voice and just it to be an honest portrayal. I mean, she has seen so much. I wanted almost the facts to present themselves. And when you actually look at the things that Jeannie's been involved in, Jeannie was the next door neighbor of Gino Hernandez, who and saw his body getting taken out of his apartment from a drug overdose. She was best friends with Tony Adams, who was Chris Adams' wife. Chris Adams had such a temper when he was drinking that he, he left a trail of casualties when it came to females. So and she's come out of all of these without all these stories without being a bitter person. All these she's seen so much negativity, but yet she's always used that negativity to almost for positive good. She's tried to use her darkness, and she's actually studied things like counseling, etc., because she's tried to use her negative experiences to help others. So that was, I just thought it was important to try and capture who she was in that respect. But also, when you look at the people around 1997 to 2000 and say 2007, in a 10-year period, there were about 60 or 70 people under 50 that died from drug overdoses or drug-related illnesses in pro wrestling under the age of 40 or 50. And when you look at that casualty list, that's unacceptable. So Jeannie was one of the few people that was such a huge drug addict at one point, but she managed to get herself clean, still remains clean, and has been for the last 6 or so years, and wanted to share her story because she's almost like the only survivor of a certain generation, whether it was Brian Pillman, Rick Rude, Kurt Hennig, so many people from even to like the generation after, like the Tests and there's so many names, basically, so many names.
Yeah.
A huge casualty list, and she's one of the sole survivors of that lifestyle.
So, whilst you clearly had fun writing this book, even though there was some deep content there, is there somebody else's autobiography that you would want to just get to grips with and write?
I mean, what I like about writing is trying to capture someone else's voice every time. So if it was another project, I'd maybe like to do somebody like maybe a dual biography of the Steiners or someone like that, or the likes of a Ron Simmons, or somebody with I like the idea of diverse backgrounds and being able to capture a different voice in every single book.
So I know I mentioned this to you off air. Do you have a Scottish wrestling history book planned? Is that something that is going to be your masterpiece down the line?
There's an ongoing Scottish there's 2 Scottish wrestling projects that I'm involved in just now that are going to be released in the next few years.
That's great to hear.